The drop weight falls and impulses the pendulum every 8 seconds, and it is the pendulum that advances the count wheel which triggers the drop weight. But as it all happens so quickly, I will slow the video down so we can see what should be happening at each stage. Here we can see the count wheel coming to the end of a cycle, just before it triggers the drop weight. The drop weight descends and impulses the pendulum. Notice how the pendulum bar now hits the limiter as its amplitude has now increased. Each following swing will decrease in amplitude, which you can see here as there is a small gap. It is vital to the function of the trigger that there should be sufficient space between the drop weight roller and the pendulum impulse arm. When the trigger has been lifted by the count wheel, the drop weight falls and closes the gap between roller and impulse arm. Here you can see that the trigger has fully disengaged from the trigger cogs. If the gap between roller and impulse arm is insufficient, then the trigger will not disengage correctly and the drop weight will not be free to impulse the pendulum. As the drop weight begins its descent, its holder arm slides past the pin on the escapement wheel holder. The trigger has now re-engaged, effectively locking the drop weight to the escapement wheel. At the same time, the escapement wheel holder has slipped off the drop arm and is now free to rotate. The escapement wheel is now released and can start to turn, lifting the drop arm until the wheel holder hits the drop weight arm. And that is basically it until the next cycle. So, what can go wrong? If the drop weight is not lifted quickly enough, or not at all, it will reconnect with the impulse arm and will slow the pendulum down. This happens when not enough drive force is getting through the gear train to lift the drop weight. As mentioned before, if the gap is insufficient between roller and impulse arm, the trigger will not disengage. If the gap is too great, then less of the drop weight's descent can impulse the clock, causing the pendulum to eventually stop. If everything is functioning as it should, but the pendulum eventually slows down, make sure that the drop weight fall is not braked by friction in its turning parts. Also check that the pendulum pins are sitting correctly. This may seem obvious, but it fooled me quite a few times.